Hello and welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Thanks for being here today. We've got a great show all set to go. John is standing by. John has an excellent guest to bring in today out of Edmonton, Alberta. Linda Blade is her name, and Linda is going to help us with a variety of issues between the trans movement and the world of sport. John, great to have you on the show today. Again, I know your time is always limited, but here we are again, and another great show ahead. So why don't you fill us in on what Linda brings to the table here today, because obviously the trans movement isn't just happening in our schools, it's happening in sport as well. So tell me more.
Brett, thank you. And as always, we couldn't do this without you. We do have Linda Blade on with us today. I couldn't be more excited because a passion of mine, what we are really about on Unmasking the Trans Movement is ultimately protecting women and children from the predation of those that would seek to manipulate, which is really grooming, getting over on them. That's both financial and sexual. People are being harmed. And women are being harmed. And what a lot of folks don't understand is there is a larger, shall we say, movement or design to ultimately relegate women to a position of insignificance, if not, I think, in a very dangerous position. And so today we're going to help people understand and connect some very important dots, because within the trans movement, the majority of the folks in the trans movement have been manipulated and therefore are being victimized and exploited. There's a certain amount of folks that are very predatorial, and a number of those. So you have financial predation. We talked about the surgeons that are doing horrible things to young people, but there are sexual predators. And these sexual predators, sexually deviant men, have no problem accessing, and they want to access the private spaces of women. And two ways they are doing that, because men, as they get into pornography, as they move down the stages of deviance, they develop a malevolence, a deep desire to traumatize women and children. What better way to traumatize women than to ensure that they can't keep you out of their private space? So whether in locker rooms, showers, rape shelters, domestic violence shelters, or prisons, where you have a captive audience of women, these men will traumatize. And I have made the case, and we're going to introduce Linda, and she can begin to describe her concerns. She is an expert in this, and she deals with athletes, but female athletes as well. And she will be able to talk about the effects this is having. I was even hearing today a podcast about Leah Thomas, this guy who on Penn State swim team is able to walk right into the locker room he's fully intact. And I thought, you know what, how many women have experienced predation? And can you imagine, you're trying to prepare for a meet, you're trying to be focused, and all of a sudden this guy is standing next to you undressed. Talk about a way to get them unfocused and to traumatize. So that is our concern, to help people understand that men are this is holding the door open now for men to be able to go in. Not only are they destroying the sport itself, because they're destroying the actual times for these women, so they are denying women their hard-earned medals, but on top of it, then they are doing what they would have been arrested for, going in and ogling, and oftentimes with camera cell phones, taking films of these female athletes. Linda, talk to us. We're going to keep this first segment short. It's hot off the press. You wrote an article, so talk to us about that. Also, tell us about the book you've written, and tell our audience why this is such a big deal. So let's talk about the article you just wrote, because you're gonna leave us here after the first segment, and then we'll pick it back up, part two, a little more leisurely pace. But talk to us about the article first, and give us your background and all of that.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me, both Brad and John. It's an honor to join you. The article was written by a major political think tank in Canada called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And this think tank published a piece yesterday and it's breaking the silence on female in sport. And so what this was, let me just explain. The Canadian government tried to hide a survey of the attitudes of and opinions of female athletes in Canada, because the result was something they didn't want people to see. And the Macdonald-Laurier Institute submitted an access to information request called ATIP in Canada. And by law, the government has to release documents if there's an official sort of route, an access to information request. And the government must release these documents if it's trying to suppress it. And so by law, they had to release the survey of female high-performance athletes in Canada and their attitudes about trans-identified males coming into their sports. And the results were so extremely concerning, because we had numbers like 85 to 90% women saying we don't want men in our sports. And that goes against the narrative in Canada, especially with this current government. So it was trying to be suppressed. So what happened was, once the Macdonald-Laurier Institute got a hold of the survey and the report on the survey, they asked me to write a forward commentary that would introduce the survey, and they posted it yesterday. So there's a lot of interest right now. And why did they ask me? Because I wrote a book on sporting, how trans activists and science denial are destroying sport. I wrote it in conjunction with the famous and well-known journalist in Canada, Barbara Kay. And that was published a couple years ago by Rebel Media in 2021. And so I have come to be seen as a somewhat of an expert in the area of how do we have sensible policy in the age of trans activism. And I am president of Athletics Alberta, and the thing that got me into it was I ran into this wall of ideology in 2018. I couldn't understand. I have my Ph.D. in human biology. I've been a track coach and athlete all my life. I just couldn't understand how in the world are we supposed to be allowing male athletes to self-identify into women's sports and have any kind of fairness or safety in women's sports. And so I went down a very deep rabbit hole trying to understand how this came about and who was pushing this policy through Canada, inside of Canada, and also internationally, the Olympic Committee. And so it's all in the book, but I've had a long history of speaking out on this on social media and in articles. And so I have a lot of information on how this happened.
Well, let's talk about that. Linda, tell us what you have uncovered.
Well, so really I do lay the first major blame at the feet of the International Olympic Committee, because they started down this path in the 1990s. And in fact, whenever they had the Olympic Games, women would be tested for, sex verification. Like, it was simply, you take a Q-tip, you do a little cheek swab, you just put that, and you can see whether there's a Y chromosome, X and Y. And it was very simple, and women were happy to be verified because we didn't want men in our sports. And sometime in the 90s, they just figured, nope, that's going to be that's violating the human rights of a few small percentage of people. And they took a survey at that time in the 1996 Olympics. All the women, like about 86% of women, said no, they didn't feel unsafe by this simple test. We want verification. And yet the International Olympic Committee went ahead for social reasons and ideological reasons. By 2000, they were allowing just the transsexuals. So the requirement was to live as a woman for 3 years and then have a surgery. And then that was passed, and nobody had any input whatsoever. Women didn't even know. Half of us didn't. We didn't know that this was what they had decided. And then somewhere in that time frame between 2000 and 2015, there were transsexual males who were transsexuals who had had the surgery and were trying to compete with the women. But when a man is castrated, that person has very low levels of testosterone, and they were finding it impossible to compete and train at all because to recover from a training bout or a game or anything or a race, they needed some testosterone. So then they went back to the IOC and asked for this therapeutic use exemption to be able to inject a little bit of testosterone into their system for their training purposes. And so by 2015, instead of the IOC admitting this was a big mistake, men should stay in men's sports. Then they threw up their hands and said, well, what are we going to do? These guys need a little bit of testosterone. No, let's just say you don't have to have the surgery. You can live as a woman, self-declare, live as a woman for 1 year and bring your testosterone just down to like 10 nanomoles per liter. Well, that sounds very nice, and that's exactly what the NCAA did as well, which eventually allowed Leah Thomas in. But the fact is that most females have testosterone levels from, say, maybe 0.8 to like 2.5. So to allow women to have testosterone levels up, even if it was maximized at 2.5 endogenously, and have the men only have to come down to 10 with all of their other physical advantages, that was no way was that going to level the playing field. And yet the International Olympic Committee just rammed that through without consulting with anybody. And so we started seeing more and more men in women's sports. And then the amazing thing is that suddenly in Canada, we had this thing as well where the very entity called the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, which was set up, by the way, after the Ben Johnson-Carl Lewis debacle in 1988, where Ben Johnson got caught doping in the Olympics, and then Canada said, we'll never be caught cheating again. And so basically the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, CCES, was set up in 2003 to do just the doping, anti-doping, so people wouldn't dope. But suddenly around 2016, around the same time Jordan Peterson started speaking out, about the same time all this stuff started happening, the CCES, the Center for Ethics in Sport, suddenly released a document saying all Canadian sports should have now a new policy that says anybody can identify as into any category they want, and there's zero surgery required, zero testosterone mitigation. And it was the most extreme policy of all in anywhere in the world, because it literally said that because they just went along with the dogma, if gender is fluid, then you might be male, you might see yourself as male one day and female the next. So then people could switch back and forth between sport categories. And Canadian universities just accepted that like it was like without question. And that's when I was reading it with the sport of track and field, because I'm the president of Athletics Alberta. And we had to figure out what our policy was going to be, the track and field in Alberta. And so I was looking to our national governing body, Athletics Canada, for guidelines. And they were just saying nationally, we're just supposed to let anybody identify as whatever they want. And I said, what are you going to do? You're going to let a 20-year-old go into 12-year-old sports category? Like, where does this end? Like, I was really shocked. Clearly, we know the difference between men and women's bodies. So we'd have world records, provincial records, national records. All the records show that in running and jumping events, men have about a 10 to 15% advantage, even as high as 20 in pole vault, because as soon as you bring in the upper body, there's even more of an advantage. And in like the throwing events, it's not even a comparison. It's, can be up to 50%. So, I mean, we just really ran into a buzzsaw, and I started resisting, and that's where we are, and that's right now where we still are.
Well, I'm glad you're resisting, Linda.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware of the fact that you have to leave us for a few minutes. You are literally going to be on air live in Canada within minutes of taping this. You've promised to come back for part 2, so maybe we'll do we'll make up for the time. There's a lot we're going to get into, including we'll discuss briefly, maybe from my perspective, what the sporting association can do. I have a few thoughts how to keep women and girls, kids safe, quite frankly. Linda, you are an expert in this. I am so appreciative. I know parents are, athletes are, that you are speaking up. Will you come back momentarily after your interview in talking about the study that was released, the report, and we will pick it up at this point and get additional insights from you, what you have seen as head of the Sporting Association. Remind our viewers again, which sporting association are you president of?
Athletics Alberta, president of the board of Athletics Alberta. That's the Track and Field Association of Alberta.
Okay. Your wealth of knowledge. Linda, we're going to pick it up at part 2 as soon as you get back from your live interview. Linda, thank you so much for being with us, and we will pick it up momentarily with you on part 2 of this podcast.
Thanks for bearing with me.
Brad.
Thank you. Well, I tell you what, we're going to check out right now. We'll be back with part 2, which is going to be extraordinary. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder, and I'll see you next time.